Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We are going to be doing our final of a three-part series with the Northeast ADA Center. Today, we will be speaking about service animals and serving customers with disabilities. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Joe Zeski from the Northeast ADA Center. Hi, Joe.
Thanks. Hi, Gary. Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for being with us today. And for those watching later, thanks for taking the time to watch our presentation. You're correct. We are here to talk about service animals and also serving customers with disabilities. And so that being said, we'll go forward to our second slide. And for those of you who have seen our other presentations in the series, you'll recognize this. It's simply a reminder that we at the Northeast ADA do not provide legal advice. We provide training, technical assistance, and research on the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we are not a legal advisor, nor do we have a role with the government in terms of enforcement. We are here to provide information in a confidential manner. We'll go to our next slide. And of course, I am Joe Zeski from the Northeast ADA, the program manager at the center, as well as the New Jersey affiliate. Joining me today is my colleague at the Northeast ADA Center, Jennifer Perry.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
And thank you, Jennifer, for being with me today. She's going to, today I'll do most of the talking, but she will be assisting with any questions in the chat, as well as other things that might need addressing. So that being said, let's move to our next slide, please.
Sure.
And who is the Northeast ADA? Let me just refresh those of you who are seeing us for the first time. We are one of 10 centers around the country that make up the ADA National Network. All share the same mission of providing information about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we do that through a 1-800 number, 1-800-949-4232. That is our technical assistance line that you can call from anywhere in the country. It will route your call to the center that serves your area. So if you're calling from an area code with based in Florida, you will reach our counterpart center, the Southeast ADA. But if you call this number and you have a New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, or U.S. Virgin Island area code, you will reach us at the Northeast ADA. You also can visit us on our website, northeastada.org, or email us at northeastada@cornell.edu. So let's dig into the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So the first section of what we're going to talk about is service animals. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to briefly review what is a service animal and what they're not, what defines some of the limits of what constitutes a service animal, and then we're going to talk about some different scenarios to sort of help think through some questions that might come up or things that we are aware of that have come up in a hotel or motel situation, or we're aware that it has been the issue in a settlement agreement from the Department of Justice at one point or another. So we have a lot to cover. And so first, let's go dig into the definition of a service animal. A quick note before I review the definition here, keep in mind that this is a definition that we're showing here for Titles 2 and 3. Title 2 deals with state and local government and everything that's related to it. So probably not many of you who are in this audience are going to be affected directly by that. However, Title III does cover public accommodations, which does include places of lodging. And this is where you're going to be touched and need to be aware of this definition. So a service animal, first of all, it's a dog who has been individually trained to perform a task for a person with a disability. And there are a couple key parts to this definition. First, the first part is that it is a dog. I think a lot of times there's misunderstanding or misconceptions out there that service animals can be almost any type of animal, a cat, a bird. We've heard all sorts of types of ideas of what could be a service animal. That's not the case. It does have to be a dog. Now, keeping that in mind, it has to be a dog. It could be any type or breed of dog, but it must be, generally speaking, a dog. There is one exception, which I'll get to in just a few moments. So the second part is that the animal has been individually trained to perform a specific task. So a service animal does a job for a person with disability. In other words, providing emotional support, while something that's important that many animals do, it's not recognized under the regulations from the Department of Justice as being a task. So sometimes people get confused that emotional support animals are service animals, and that's not the case. In fact, a dog must do a specific job. So it might pick up an object for its handler. It might provide a service like an alert for a seizure, or perhaps for a diabetes alert dog. There are many different types, which we'll get into in just a few moments, but it must do a specific task for a person with a disability. It's also important to keep in mind that service dogs are not just guide dogs, quote unquote, or hearing dogs. And a lot of times people are most familiar with guide dogs for people who are blind or visually impaired. There are many types of dogs, though, who serve and function many people with various different types of disabilities. So speaking to this, again, not just a guide dog. And there's a range, including physical disabilities, of course, but people also may have psychiatric disabilities. They may have disabilities that affect their neurological systems, disabilities, in other words, that you won't be able to see. You might call them non-obvious disabilities. But then there is just a way to remind you of the variety of types of things a service dog may assist with. We'll get into more detail on that in the future. Last two important things to keep in mind as a business owner is that there are no licenses for service animals. There are organizations, and you can find them on the internet or even through Amazon, probably, or at least at one time you could, who will sell people licenses or claim to, quote unquote, register a dog as a service animal. There is no registry under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There is no special license required. So that means that essentially, unfortunately, these businesses out there claiming to have a registry or to be part of a quote unquote federal registry are really scamming people. There is no actual registry for a service animal, despite what people may think. Lastly, as a business owner, it's important to know, a lot of times people ask questions about, well, is there ever a time when I can have a service animal, removed from my premises? Or what about if a service animal does X to another patron or another customer? We'll get into a few of those questions in scenarios later, but it's important to keep in mind here that under the ADA, handlers, service animal handlers, must always have control of the animal. So if a dog is wandering off by itself, if it's acting in a way that's not appropriate, we'll get into more details about that later, but you can ask to have the animal removed. However, you can't ask the person with disability to leave at the same time, but you can ask them to remove the animal. So we'll explore that more in a little while. So now that I've told you all about it being a dog and limited to dogs, let's throw in a monkey wrench here. There is one possible exception, and we have it here on on this slide with this cute picture of a miniature horse. this is certainly a less common service animal. Like I said, almost always you're going to be encountering a dog, but technically there is an exception under the ADA for miniature horses to be service animals. So be aware that it is possible for service animals to be a miniature horse as well as a dog. But again, that is the only exception in terms of the species of animal from a dog. So please be aware of that. Let's go to our next slide. And a lot of times we receive questions here at the center about, well, how can I verify that a service animal is in fact a service animal, or how can I find out if someone's being legitimate, or are they just quote unquote trying to scam me or scam our business or an agency or whatever. As with other parts of the ADA, a lot of this is good faith on both sides. However, any public accommodation, any business, including hotels, are able to ask two questions of someone who has a service animal. You can ask, what task, is this animal a service animal needed because of a disability? In other words, you're establishing that they are, in fact, saying it is a service animal and that they do have a disability. And second, what task has it been trained to perform? So just to unpack this a little bit, with the first question, keep in mind that you can't ask what specific disability someone has. You're not really permitted to ask that because again, a lot of the types of disabilities aren't going to be visible ones. So keep in mind that is sort of a limit or something you need to be aware of when asking that first question. Is this animal a service animal needed because of a disability? The second one gets to the heart of an important distinction, that service animals are trained to do tasks. They're trained to do specific jobs for a person with a disability. So again, someone may think that their dog, which provides emotional support for them, is a service animal. But in fact, that's not going to be the case, and that's not going to be true. So keep that in mind, and that is part of what you can ask for with the second question. Now, be aware, you can't ask them, being the handler and the service animal, to demonstrate the task. And why is that? It's because, one, there is a certain right to privacy regarding someone's disability, or the need not to disclose it. Two, many disabilities and the tasks that a service dog might perform can't be done on command. Let's say someone has a dog that alerts them to an impending seizure. Well, the dog can't recreate that. If someone's not having a seizure, is not going to be trained to do so, because that would, endanger the real circumstance of a seizure. So in terms of providing good information. So keep that in mind as we go ahead. Let's go forward and look at some of the different types of disabilities that service animals are used for. And with this, again, keep in mind that there's a variety. So you have people with more physical disabilities, or ones that you might think of as more obvious or more apparent, things that if someone came to your front desk, you might be able to tell earlier someone has a visible physical disability. Perhaps they're using a walker, perhaps they're using a wheelchair, or perhaps you can just tell from their gait that they may have a disability. People who have vision or hearing related disabilities, those might be more detectable. But as I mentioned earlier, there are many types of non-obvious disabilities, ones that you can't see, that are nevertheless disabilities, and you should be really aware of. So on that second part, let's go to our next slide and take a look at some examples of, and I'll sort of explain through providing examples of what types of disabilities dogs may assist with. Some people have issues around arthritis. Again, that may or may not be visible. but a service dog might help related to that condition. Someone who has poor balance may need a dog to provide stability. So they may have a mid-size or a little bit larger dog to provide stability for them when they're walking. You heard me mention some of these other things, diabetes in terms of a dog that might alert someone to a low blood sugar or perhaps to a high blood sugar. Seizure dogs, you heard me mention that earlier as well for people who have seizures. There are also people who have psychiatric disabilities, and there are dogs that do specific tasks for that. Now, on this one here, keep in mind that psychiatric service dogs are, in fact, a type of service dog, and they may do things like dealing with breaking negative behaviors and so forth. For example, if someone has obsessive compulsive disorder, they may break or interrupt someone's who is getting into a repetitive cycle, or perhaps someone has panic disorder. A dog may jump on its owner to break the cycle and thereby hopefully to relieve the disability, the condition caused by the disability. So again, there are psychiatric service dogs. So be aware, even though I said there are no emotional support dogs, it doesn't mean there are not psychiatric service dogs. So be aware of that. So let's go to our next slide and see some of the possible tasks that service animals do. And you see here a wide list. A lot of the ones I've already mentioned. A few, though, maybe that I haven't touched on to this point, are dogs that help people to pick up objects or to pull things. For example, someone perhaps using a wheelchair may need assistance doing these things. They may have a service dog to help do this. Some dogs are trained to tell their owners when they need to take their medicine, the time to take their medicine. Other dogs help with things that I may have mentioned before, things such as balance, or dogs being alerts for providing alerts to their owners for sounds in the environment that they need to be aware of, or perhaps providing wayfinding, in other words, guidance that you might think of with a more traditional guide dog. Let's go to our next slide. So with service animals, I know I've mentioned it, but I'm repeating it here just because it's important and it's a very necessary distinction to bring up, because it comes up so often in terms of calls that we receive at the Northeast ADA, as well as at other ADA centers around the country, that a service animal is not the same as a comfort animal or emotional support animal. And there is a lot of confusion on this, as I said, in the public. Even among people who have disabilities, they may think that, oh, my dog is a service animal because, I need it for my mental well-being, and which may in fact be the case. However, under the regulations, as I mentioned, from the Department of Justice, emotional support is not recognized as a task. And so those animals are not protected. If the animal only provides, I say only, but it's a very large thing, but it's not, if it only provides emotional support, it's not considered to be a service animal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are protections for emotional support animals in private housing, but that's a separate conversation for a different law called the Fair Housing Act. That's a whole nother presentation we won't get into today. But be aware, service animals must do a task, and they must be individually trained to perform the task for their owners. Well, we've thrown a lot of information at you. Let's go to our next slide, and we're about to start some scenarios to look at some of the issues that might come up around service animals. Let me just pause to make sure no one put anything in the chat box before I dive into this section of our time today. All right, I don't think we have anything. So that being said,
wait, Joe, I'm sorry, Joe, this is Jen. Let me see. We did receive one question, and the
I'm
question
sorry. I
is,
apologize.
how would you distinguish between someone who has a dog for PTSD from someone who claims they are emotional support?
That's a really good question. With PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for someone who is not familiar with PTSD, it can have a lot of different effects, but a lot of times it involves a reaction to something in the environment that covers or that causes a traumatic experience to resurface for someone, often with a very negative consequence or reaction. And with a service animal for PTSD, a lot of times they may do something like perhaps they would go before their owner into a space to clear, to make sure it was safe. They also, as I mentioned earlier, with someone with a panic disorder, they may take an action that if their handler is experiencing PTSD, they may take an action like nuzzling the owner's chest with their nose to change their focus. Jennifer, I don't know if you had any other examples. Those were two I could think of off the top of my head, but they're
right. And I mean, and this question kind of gets to the heart of a lot of the problems that we have with service animals that many businesses especially face, and that's that, Joe went over those two questions. So if somebody had a service dog and they said it was their dog, and yes, it's needed because of a disability, and it's been trained to perform searches of the rooms, due to my anxiety, due to my PTSD, they wouldn't even have to disclose that, but even if they did, they've answered those two questions so that they've, attested that they have a disability, and that the service dog has been trained to perform a specific task. So at that point, you really can't ask anything else of that person. Even if you suspect that it might be an emotional support dog, if they've answered those two questions correctly, you then have to kind of accept that response. Now, as time goes on, if this dog, is not under control of the handler, if it is barking and out of control and bothering other guests, at that point in time, we know that, the dog is required to be under the control of their handler. So you do have some recourse to go back to the owner of the animal at that point in time. But unless the dog is, posing a direct threat or acting unruly, you really kind of do have to take someone at their word when they answer those two questions correctly.
Jennifer, if I can just make a side note here too, for our hoteliers, I think it's important that if there are instances where someone says that this is a service animal and you do have those issues where maybe the dog's not in control or you have complaints that come in, if you have a daily logbook or a place that you can take notes about events that happen at the hotel, it's always good to document that stuff, just in case there is ever a question or a lawsuit that arises out of it. You can say, we have it logged here. This is what happened with this guest. We allowed them to stay, but the dog was running around the hotel grounds uncontrolled, blah, 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 whatever it happens to be. At least you have it documented, and it's not just, oh, well, I remember this person and we had problems with a dog. If it's documented, it gives you a better opportunity to defend yourself in the future.
It's a good idea. So, definitely.
Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, then maybe we'll go to the first scenario.
Sure.
And what I'll do is I will actually read off the scenario, and we'll then turn to our following slide with the possible answer options and see if people have thoughts about what we should do here. But in case people may have difficulty reading the slides, I'll read it here. Peter is working the front desk and at the hotel, and this particular hotel has a no pets policy except for service animals. A guest comes to check in and has a dog with them. The dog is wearing a vest that says service animal on the side of it. Peter makes a mental note that the person doesn't have an obvious disability. So that being said, what can Peter do? And actually, let's go to our next slide and we'll see the options. So we have a couple of choices here. Peter can, one, allow in the service animal. After all, the dog is registered and wearing a vest. Choice number two, ask its owner to have the dog show him what it has been trained to do. Or number three, ask if the dog is required, because of a disability, and what task has the dog been trained to perform. So we have three options here. And before we turn to the slide, let's see if anyone put in a guess in the chat box about what number they would pick, 1, 2, or 3.
I'm seeing a few threes, Joe.
That's good. People are paying attention.
Yes.
Let's go to our next slide. And that is, in fact, the choice to make. Again,
Yes.
In fact, Jennifer, you were just talking about this. There are the two questions that you can ask. And that's what Peter should do in the situation if he's not sure what to do, or if he's not sure of the quote unquote legitimacy of the guest with their service animal. Keep in mind, too, that while vests often do indicate if a dog is a service animal, much like that license that I mentioned earlier, the registry, those actually can be bought online. So you don't have a quote unquote special place that those vests must come from. But often people who do have service animals use them so that other people in the public are aware that it is a working animal that shouldn't be distracted from work when it's wearing the vest. But in and of itself, it doesn't quote unquote certify that it is in fact a service animal. All right, let's go to our next scenario. And in this one, Heather is monitoring the gate at the pool area at the Relaxing Suites Hotel. A woman comes to the pool and states that her dog is a service animal. It's an alert dog. Heather allows the woman to enter the area. Excuse me one moment. But reminds her that the dog is not allowed into the water. The woman leashes the dog, and however, when the woman gets in the pool to swim, the dog begins barking at other swimmers. Politely, Heather, our worker here, asks the owner to please control the dog and to stop the extra barking. The dog is quiet when the owner is nearby. However, as soon as the guest goes back into the pool, the dog begins to bark again. What can Heather do? So again, we have a dog here. It's claimed to be an alert dog. It's leashed, and so it's not in the pool where it shouldn't be. It goes in when the guest goes in the water, it starts barking. And when she comes out, it stops. What can Heather do? You know, she's dealing with a situation here that can be a little difficult. So what can Heather do? Let's look at our options on our next slide. We have choice number one, Heather can give the dog some chips from her lunch, hoping that it will quiet down. Or option number two, she can apologize, but explain to other guests that this is a service animal and she has to allow the service animal. Option three is she can tell the owner that because the dog is barking, that both need to leave the pool area. Or option number four, Heather can let the patron know that the dog must remain under her control at all times. And if it persists in barking, she will ask her to have the dog leave the area. Which of these choices, 1, 2, 3, or 4, do you think is the right course of action for Heather here?
I'll let you know what we're seeing. I think I'm seeing some 4s, Joe. Yep.
Excellent. Excellent. Again, people have been picking up on what we've been saying, and that's exactly right on our next slide. The important thing to keep in mind is that the handler is responsible for the conduct of the animal. So if a dog in this case is barking a lot unnecessarily, or if it's not related to the person's disability. So I'm saying if the person is just swimming and is barking, not serving a task purpose, it's just barking a lot. Or perhaps someone has a dog that they're just in the lobby with. It appears to be a service dog, but it's barking at other people or being aggressive towards other guests or jumping, or as I mentioned earlier, it's wandering off. Again, those are signs that this may not be a service animal, or at the very least, there are signs that the animal is not under the control of the handler, which it has to be. So when those cases come up, you can ask the handler to remove their service animal, but you can't exclude the person with a disability. So in this case, we have Heather in the pool, where the right course was to tell the owner that if it's not under her control, it will have to leave. In other circumstances, you may have to find solutions where the animal can be removed. However, the person themselves may need to be, well, would need to be allowed to remain. So, all right, let's go to one more scenario really quick here. And again, this is just to touch on something we talked about earlier. Charlie has an American Pit Bull Terrier that is serving him as his seizure alert dog. Now, while at the hotel, another guest states to Charlie that pit bulls are banned, that pit bulls are banned in the local municipality, and that they're going to call the police to report Charlie. He tries to explain to the other guest that this is his service animal, but the other person is upset, already pulling out their phone to make a call. So when municipalities have breed-specific laws that ban certain dogs in certain breeds of dogs, can Charlie here, in other words, can the person with a disability get in trouble for bringing that breed of dog in the municipality as a service dog? So in other words, does Charlie in this situation, even though pit bulls are restricted in this city or this town, does he have the right to bring a service dog who happens to be an American Pit Bull Terrier into the municipality? And this is not necessarily straightforward and easy, but we'll give the answer in a second. On our next slide, you see our two options. So either yes, that's because Charlie has to be aware of the local ordinances, or no, there is no restriction on the breed of the breed of dog for a service animal serving a person with a disability. So yes, Charlie should be aware. No, there's no restriction on the breed of dog that can be a service animal.
All right, let me see. I see a 2 and another 2.
All right, well, let's go to our next slide. And correct. No, the answer here is no. Charlie doesn't need to be aware. If it in fact is a service animal, it has the right to go anywhere, regardless of the municipal laws. That's because in this instance, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is a federal law. And one of the principles in it that some of you may have heard of from one of our earlier webinars was that where there are 2 or more laws regarding non-discrimination against a person with disability, whichever law provides the greater protection needs to be followed. And that's the case here. If there is a law that, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, that in fact provides a protection for a person with disability, it would supersede local law. Now, that being said, there are some caveats to keep in mind. The first being, or the first and most important, is that there is something known as direct threat under the ADA. That's under Title 2 and 3, and it's an idea that some accommodation or modification of a policy does not need to be made if it would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others. And there is that possibility. However, deciding what is a direct threat has to be case specific and done individually, on a one-on-one basis. So a ban on all pit bulls would not apply here. However, if Charlie's dog in this circumstance exhibited aggressive behavior or took some action that put other people in some danger or risk, not just being there, not the simple presence of the animal making people uncomfortable, that's not a direct threat. But if the animal threatened another guest or patron, then the animal could be removed from the municipality, not to mention your premises as well. But so be aware, there are no bans on breeds of animals. However, every situation is unique. And so it needs to be looked at on that basis under the ADA. We covered a lot. And before we transition here fully into how do we best serve customers with disabilities, let me just see if there were any other questions that people might want to ask about service animals. And I'll have a short time at the end too, but let me just pause here briefly. All right. Well, let's get into it then. So we've been talking about service animals. Let's turn the page, so to say, and talk about serving customers with disabilities. What goes into that and what really offers effective and respectful customer service. And one thing that I think really gets to the heart of providing service to customers with disabilities are the basic ideas that you would associate just with good customer service, dealing with individuals in a respectful way to make sure that they feel that they are being heard, respected, listened to, and valued as both consumers, as guests, and as customers, regardless whether or not they have a disability. And if you expand those ideas out just a little bit, you'll probably wind up generally providing good service to a customer with disability. So let's keep that thought in mind as we begin with a short cartoon on our next slide. And again, for those of you who may have difficulty seeing the slide, we have one gentleman with glasses talking to another gentleman who is using a wheelchair, and he says to that person, that gentleman in the chair using the wheelchair, what do you prefer to be called? Handicap, disabled, or physically challenged? The gentleman in the wheelchair says back, well, Joe will do. And I like this cartoon because it really gets to the heart of what I'm talking about here. And that is that people with disabilities are people. And so if you're just looking at providing the best customer service you can and the best service to guests that you can, odds are you're going to stay pretty well on track. People with disabilities are just like any other person. You may not even realize someone has a disability. So providing that good customer service, whether or not you quote unquote see someone has a disability, is important and key. And doing things, the small things that you would do for anybody to make them feel welcome, will really carry you far along the road. So let's look at an important question in terms of language. Some of what this cartoon gets to is often people are a little bit nervous about, well, how do I refer to someone who may have a disability? And we generally recommend that people follow person-first language. Now, in more recent years, in the last 5 years, there has been some more push towards what's called identity-first language. However, when you don't know what someone's preference is, how they identify in terms of disability being a part of who they are, use person first language. In other words, put the emphasis on the person, not their disability. And you see here in the little chart on this slide some examples of ways to do that. For example, using the words, instead of using a word like afflicted with a disability or condition, you replace that with a person with a disability, because you're focusing on the dignity of the individual, the person, and not on the disability. And you're providing the person not only respect, but empowering the individual by doing that. Changing some other common terminology like handicap parking and using the term accessible parking has the same intent. Handicap has a very negative connotation because of how it's been used over time and perhaps what it means in its origins. So the word has fallen out of disuse, generally speaking, and it's replaced now typically with the word accessible. So an accessible bathroom, accessible parking, et cetera, et cetera. One other example of person first language I'll point out here is referring to someone as autistic, sort of the older way of referring to someone who has autism, or someone is on the autism spectrum, is a newer way and more preferred way of referring to a person with a disability, because, again, it's empowering and recognizing that at heart, it's about a person who happens to have a disability, not just the disability itself. So that's a little bit about language and choosing the words we use when talking to people with disabilities. Keep in mind that you may or may not know whether or not a customer has a disability. So again, focusing on the person will be the way to really develop a general best practice in delivering your customer service. But let's look at some specific examples of disabilities now and how you might be able to assist individuals who have these types of disabilities. And we'll begin first with mobility disabilities. And of course, a mobility disability can be brought about from all sorts of different conditions. Some people may have cerebral palsy. Some people may have knee replacements. Some people may have genetic conditions that restricted or their use of their legs or perhaps their extremities. There are a number of different reasons why people have mobility disabilities, extremely wide variety. And here are a few tips to keep in mind when providing customer service to those individuals. First, keep in mind that any personal mobility aid, like a walker, a balance cane, a wheelchair, think of that as part of the person's physical body, as part of their physical space. And so if you have someone that's, assisting a customer who has asked for some assistance, let's just say taking bags to their rooms, the person assisting them should be aware of, the wheelchair, the mobility aid is almost like a part of the person. And so they shouldn't touch or intrude on that space, just as you would expect someone not to intrude on the physical space of someone who didn't have a mobility disability. Next issue is in terms of having a longer conversation with someone, perhaps using a wheelchair. Someone using a wheelchair is more likely to be at a lower height than other individuals who might be standing. If that's going to be the case, and you're going to have more than just a very brief interaction, you want to make sure that for the person's comfort and to provide more of an equal balance in terms of a conversation, try to sit and be at the same level in terms of height as the person. Again, reduces strain from them perhaps needing to look up, and it provides more of an equal power dynamic as well. The last tip we have here is that if someone is walking with a person using a mobility aid of some sort, just be mindful that your walking speed matches the pace of the person using the mobility aid. So if someone is assisting a guest, maybe who's using a walker, and they need to go a little bit slower, whoever is assisting them, that staff should be aware of not rushing or going ahead of the person too far, because the staff's normal walking pace is going to be faster than someone using a walker for mobility. So again, matching speed and pace is important. Let's go to our next slide. And this slide here, and actually the next slide as well, gets to the issue of serving patrons who have visual related disabilities. Keep in mind that this really covers a range of disability, as with the other conditions that I'm sort of highlighting here today. So someone who has a visual disability could be totally blind, or perhaps someone could be low vision. Perhaps they can only see things that are literally directly ahead of them in terms of their field of vision. They may not have peripheral vision. Or the opposite can be true too, where someone only is able to see things out of their peripheral vision and not directly ahead, not straight ahead. And there's all sorts of other conditions that are possible as well that impact vision. So keeping that in mind, when you're working with someone with a vision disability, first, a general tip is identify yourself. Who are you when you're engaging them for the first time? And particularly if you're serving a customer or a guest with a vision impairment, someone who wouldn't know your voice necessarily, identify yourself when you come into conversation with them, so they know who you are, where you're from, so they know who is present and in the conversation. If they happen to ask for directions, be very specific, more specific than we typically tend to be. Often, if someone asks for directions, we'll say it's down the hall and to the right. If someone is very low vision or has no vision, that could be sort of a loaded set of directions. There could be a couple tables in the hallway along the way, or maybe there's 3 doors that are all on the right side of that hallway. So you want to be more specific in terms of how you share directions with someone who has a vision disability. Another key for vision-related disabilities, but again, for any disability, is always feel free to offer assistance to the individual. However, listen to what the person is saying. Often people may want to help, and in their sort of enthusiasm, they'll do more harm than good. I used to have a colleague who was visually impaired. She was more a slight person, only about 5 feet tall, and she had very low vision, and she was preparing to cross the street one day, and someone thought they were being helpful and said, "Oh, let me help you cross," and basically propelled her across the street. Not safe, not good. She hadn't accepted or said that she wanted help, for one, but she also hadn't accepted help. That person, again, was well-intentioned, but could have actually injured my colleague very easily, unintentionally, causing a trip or a fall. So again, ask if someone needs assistance, but follow what they say. Let them guide you about what they need. Let's go to our next slide. And these are just examples of some other types of assistance you might need to provide at the hotel. You heard me mention providing directions. Also, someone may request assistance, perhaps going to a location in the hotel. They may ask for a sighted guide. In other words, how to find the way. Sighted guide is where one person, a sighted person, would give their elbow to an individual who is blind or low vision, and the person who has a disability would be about a half a step behind the individual, and they would follow them to a specific location or wherever they need to go. So wayfinding is one option. People also might need assistance with alternate formats, or perhaps filling in forms. Perhaps someone who is very low vision needs help finding, where do I need to sign to check in. Perhaps that might be a need, or perhaps someone may need assistance signing a slip, a billing slip. There are many different options that are possible. And of course, service animals are another form of accommodation that a hotel might need to make in allowing a service dog into the premises. Let's focus now on hearing-related disabilities. And then after we talk about this, we'll talk about speech-related disabilities. And there's some overlap here in some of the issues that come up with these different types of disabilities. First, in terms of if someone is deaf or hard of hearing, and either through a companion or through an actual sign language interpreter is communicating with you, direct any comments that are relevant to the person with a hearing disability to that person. In other words, don't talk around a person using an interpreter or using a companion to help communicate. Even though a person may or may not be verbally communicating with you, if that's sort of the person is the source of the conversation, the source of the question, direct focus to the person, not to a companion or an interpreter. A few other little tips if someone is deaf, or again, very hard of hearing, they may not know that you're entering a conversation or trying to engage them. You may need to gently tap them on the shoulder to make sure they're aware, or use some hand signals to make sure that they know you're trying to get their attention. If you happen to be someone speaking with an individual who reads lips, now, not all people do. In fact, probably majority of people who have hearing-related disabilities may or may not read lips. But if you are talking with someone who does, be sure that things are away from directly in front of your mouth, and realize that there may be challenges if you're a gentleman who has a beard. It might make it a little more difficult for the person to understand you if they're focusing on reading your lips to communicate. So be aware, these are some possible issues that you might encounter. Also, if someone's hearing has impacted their speech and they're verbally trying to communicate with you and you don't understand what they said, don't make best guesses. If you truly don't understand what someone has said, the best course is not to avoid or pretend you understood what they said, but rather to engage the person and say, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't understand. You're not going to be the first person who's ever asked them to repeat something. It doesn't mean that a person won't get annoyed, but odds are they won't, particularly if you do it in a respectful way. They're going to be willing to repeat themselves, and you want to make sure that you're accurately understanding what they're trying to communicate with you and to you. And so taking the time to ask them to repeat instead of just assuming is really a wise course to take. And let's go to the next slide. And when working with individuals who do have speech-related disabilities, I'll sort of begin at the end and work back. Again, if you don't understand what someone has said because they have a speech disability, it's okay to ask someone to repeat what they've said. And if it persists, you're not able after a couple attempts to understand what someone has said, try an alternative if you have to. Use a pen or pencil. Find another way to communicate, but don't simply throw in the towel or ignore what the person is saying. Rather, engage the person and try to understand what they're trying to communicate with you. With speech disabilities, it may take someone longer to verbalize what they're trying to say. So in those cases, obviously, as a person providing customer service, it requires patience on your part, and allowing someone this time and space they need is very important and critical. We're based in the Northeast in New York and New Jersey, and our region is not particularly known for patient people. And so when we're doing trainings in person here locally, it's something I always point out to people in the audience is we're not known for this, but it's important to keep in mind that patients, something as simple as providing extra time can be a form of great customer service, as well as also providing a modification to the way things are usually done under the ADA. So again, keep that in mind as well. What about a few tips maybe for working with both individuals, some things to keep in mind. We'll go to our next slide here. Again, both someone who has a speech disability and individuals who have hearing disabilities may or may not use an interpreter. If they are using an interpreter, again, your focus should be on the person with a disability, the person trying to communicate, not the interpreter. It may not be sort of natural to, or maybe natural to sort of focus on the person, quote unquote, verbalizing to us. But in this instance, it's the person who's ultimately starting the communication that you need to focus on and should focus on. Also, be aware that some people with speech disabilities may use technology to communicate. So they may use a device called a pocket talker, or some nowadays you can do apps on your phone where if they have difficulty speaking, someone may use electronic assistive technology to verbalize what they want to say. And as we mentioned, time being the other key important factor. Let's go to our next slide. With hidden disabilities, important to keep in mind that you don't know whether or not someone has diabetes, or someone has cancer, or someone has maybe a neurological condition, or someone may have a psychiatric disability. And so you may not always understand why someone is asking for a form of assistance or a form of accommodation. But when you have those circumstances, follow the person's lead. Let them help guide you in terms of providing what they need. Again, you may or may not find out what, in fact, a person's disability is. But in general terms, it's just best policy to try to meet what the person is asking for, unless it's something more substantial where maybe you need some clarity. But in general, if someone's asking for a modification or a change, best policy is to try to follow it. Now, again, with that, also don't assume that someone has a disability or how their disability is going to impact them. Everyone's going to be different. And a lot of those disabilities that we talked about earlier back in the service animal slide are ones that are not going to be visible. Plus, there are many, many others besides. So what kind of requests might you get if someone has a hidden disability? Let's go to our next slide. Well, there are a couple of things. Perhaps someone asks for help when they're, checking in with doing the paperwork. It may not seem obvious why they need help doing it, but perhaps they have an issue related to a traumatic brain injury, or perhaps someone is, had a stroke and now has difficulty doing that sort of work. They may ask for assistance, or someone may go into an area needing to be accompanied by a support individual. These are all things that are types of accommodations that may not be connected always to an obvious disability. But these are just a few examples. There are plenty of others that are out there that could be related to a hidden disability. So what about some takeaways that we might have? And let's go to our next slide. So this is just a list of some different key points, really summing up what we've talked about through this section, but really what we've also talked about throughout today is, first, when you're working with people who may or may have a disability, the important thing is to relax. Remember, we're all people. And so some people have conditions that impact them in certain ways. But at heart, we're all individuals looking for respect. And sometimes some of us may need to do things a little bit differently than others. So treating every person with respect, again, being key. Treating adults as adults. For example, if you're having a conversation with someone who happens to use a sign language interpreter, focusing on the person doing the actual communicating, not on the interpreter. Again, treating a person with a respect that they would hope for and expect. Using appropriate language, like that person first language we talked about a few minutes ago. Also, very important. At the heart of it, listening to the person is important, whether that's providing assistance to them, or trying to find out what customer needs. You won't know that unless you listen to what they're saying. And that's true as well for a person with a disability, whether they're visually impaired, like the example I talked about a little bit earlier, or perhaps there's someone who may have another type of disability that's not obvious, that's asking for help to do paperwork or something of that nature. In terms of service animals, always keep in mind there are clear regulations around what a service animal is and is not. And if someone is accompanied by a service animal, it's going to be a working animal. And as natural as it may be, or a natural desire by a lot of people to interact with a dog, if they see one, keep in mind that if it is a service animal, it's working. And so it shouldn't be distracted from what it's trying to do. And at the end, as I started with, it's all about respect. That's sort of where we circle back to. And as with any customer, whether or not they have a disability, if you focus on providing respectful, engaging service, you're probably going to stay on the right track and do the right things. But we sort of laid out some of the tips here along the way that might make it a little bit easier to figure out how to best live out that practice and adopt that principle into how your staff serves people with disabilities. Let's go to our next slide, and we'll pause briefly just to see if there are any questions in the chat box before we wrap up today.
I'm not seeing anything right now, Joe.
Jennifer, let's bring up our next slide just so people can see our map of the ADA National Network.
Sure.
And just to remind everyone, Jennifer and I, are from the Northeast ADA. We serve New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But there are ADA centers around the country. There are 9 other centers, a total of 10 in the network altogether, that all can provide information about the Americans with Disabilities Act, about serving customers with disabilities, about best practices and policies. We're all here to be a resource, and certainly Jennifer and I are glad to be a resource. If you want to reach out to us directly, please feel free to do so, but be aware the ADA National Network is out there. It's a resource for you, and thank you for tuning in today, and we're glad to have been here and be a part of this. And Gary and Bridget as well, thank you for hosting us today.
Yes, thank you both.
Thanks so much,
and thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Jennifer. This really has been a great series. There's been a lot of enlightening information, I believe, shared with us throughout the 3. So I thank you for your time and your knowledge. And I encourage any of our franchisees who may possibly have questions to reach out to this number, and you'll be in touch with your local ADA center. And you're always welcome to reach out to your AMP directors if you just want to bounce some ideas off of them. So this session, I think, is going to be very helpful for many of our franchisees. So I thank you guys for all the hard work you put into putting this together.